So I'm just going to recap. I'm just going to move you out of the way on my screen. So we're going to think about how plants grow and compete with each other and what affects their growth, and recap a bit of what we've talked about last time with nutrients and things. So obviously plants have different depth of root and they have different heights of top growth, and they need to be able to capture sunlight so they can photosynthesize and make food, and their roots need to be able to access nutrients within the ground. That's what we need to be thinking about when we're thinking about planting distances and companion planting and thinning. So for what we need for plant growth, that's what we're going to think about first of all, is good healthy soil and nutrition. And now we're well into the growing season, plants can start to run out of food. So especially plants that we keep taking a crop from. So things like tomatoes, where we keep taking the right crop off of, and they've still got more tomatoes to ripen, and beans and peas that we keep picking and cropping, we're asking a lot of them. Whereas in nature, they'd produce one lot and then they've made seed and then the plant dies. Whereas we keep picking their crop and they have to produce more. So we need to make sure that the soil is healthy and got enough nutrition. So organic matter is top of the list. So if you're growing in the soil, in the ground, rather than in a pot, providing organic matter at planting time is really important. And we've talked about Mach. We've talked about compost. But at this time of year, now our crops are growing, we can be mulching with organic matter. And a mulch is something you put on the surface of the soil. And what the organic matter is doing is it's increasing the life within the soil. It's increasing the tiny little microbes and the earthworms. And as they break down the organic matter, they're releasing the nutrients for your plant. It helps the texture of the soil, so then the roots can get through and have access. It holds moisture, so it works like a sponge, but it releases the water as well. And it holds on to nutrients so they're not leached when it rains. So for mulching, we can, like I said, organic matter such as garden compost, but we can also use grass cuttings and wood chip, and we can use a living mulch as well. So the job of a mulch is it holds in the moisture, which obviously when we've had lots of rain doesn't seem that important, but after all the rain that we've had, now we've had a few days sun, all that moisture is evaporating off the soil, and we don't want to have to go back to watering and being slaves to the watering cans. So if you put down a mulch after heavy rain or after a good soaking of water, then that keeps the moisture in there and stops it evaporating. The mulch also protects from soil loss. So if it's really windy or if we have heavy rain, the soil can wash away. So it's keeping it where it should be. But one of the best gardening friends is the fact that it helps with suppressing weeds. So good thick mulch stops all your annual weeds germinating, and that will save you loads of time with weeding, and it reduces the competition. If you've got too much weed there, they're competing for lights and nutrients with the crop that you're trying to get. And it can also help with some pests. It can protect the crowns of your brassicas, and it can protect against carrot root fly and things like that, just by covering the top of the soil surface. Some of the mulches, depending on what you use, can add nutrients. So if it's good nutrient-rich organic matter, like your garden compost, that's adding nutrients. Whereas things like wood chip and grass cuttings, they add some nutrients, but mainly they're adding bulky organic matter. And it can look very attractive, depending on what you use. It just finishes your bed off, defines an area, and tidies everything up. So we can use man-made mulches like plastic or cardboard or old carpet. We can use organic mulches, which I've just mentioned, or like in this picture, we've got a living mulch, and this is clover. If you're using clover, you have to use a short clover, and you can use tares as well. And they're both nitrogen fixing, so they're not in competition for nitrogen as a nutrient because they're making their own. And you can cut them back, you can trim them, and then that adds to the bulky organic matter in the soil. And using clover with your cabbages and your brassicas like this actually confuses the cabbage white butterfly, because they can smell the cabbages, they fly up, and it's all just green. They can't differentiate. And the butterfly comes along, it lands on 3 plants, and if those 3 plants are brassicas, it then lays its eggs. So this is a good way of confusing the pests, and then they fly off and go somewhere else. So I'm just going to recap nutrients. I think we talked about this before. There's 3 main nutrients your plants need. That's nitrogen, phosphorus and potassium. And it's always written as NPK in this order. A good way of remembering that is just think of the word napkin. If you write napkin, then you get the order NPK. And on fertilizer packets and things like that, it's always written in this order. And they don't always say NPK, they just give you numbers. So if you look at your tomato rights or your lawn feed, they'll have numbers on, and those numbers represent these 3 nutrients. So nitrogen is very good for leafy growth. So it's important early on in the season when you've got all your little seedlings in pots, and sometimes you haven't got the ground prepared and you hold them in the pots too long, and then they benefit from a nitrogen feed. And you can make your own nitrogen feed by using nettles, and making a brew of nettles, which is high in nitrogen. Then you've got phosphorus, and that's needed for root growth and root development. It's one of the big pollutants that conventional farmers use a lot of, and it leaches out for carrots and parsnips and crops like that. Organically, we get phosphorus from bone meal. So traditionally growers would put bone meal when they plant a new tree or shrub or something like that. And then the K is for potassium, which is needed for flowers and fruits. And this is what we need to think about at the moment, this time of year. And so our tomatoes start to show nutrient deficiencies in their old leaves, the lower leaves, the big ones. You might see some yellowing, some red tinging going on, and this will be a potassium deficiency, because all that energy is now going to ripening the fruit. And so a tomato fertilizer like Tomato Right, or one that you make at home, would be high in potassium. And what we can use at home for that is comfrey. We can make a comfrey tea fertilizer that we water onto our plants in a dilute solution every week or every fortnight or something. And that just keeps your fruit going, keeps it ripening, keeps your plants healthy. And so plants need these 3 nutrients in quite large quantities, and they're using them up all the time. And if you've got good, healthy organic soil, all the microbes and earthworms are working with your soil, breaking down the minerals, breaking down the organic matter in there, and releasing these nutrients for your plants. But like I said before, our annual veg crops are producing a lot again and again for us because we keep harvesting them. So sometimes we have to give them a little bit of a boost so that they keep providing the crops for us. And this is why the potassium feed at this time of year is quite important. So I've said napkin. This is visual help for any of you. It might help you or hinder you, I don't know. But napkin's a good way of remembering the letters, go in that order, NPK. And K is a confusing one because it's potassium. So trying to remember whether P or K is phosphorus or potassium gets confusing. But if you think K as kettle and potassium as pots. A kettle and a pot go together, so that's one way of remembering that. Then you've got secondary nutrients that are also very important for the plants, but they need them in smaller quantities, but they do still need them, and that's calcium. And calcium's needed for cell growth. You get a lot of calcium on an alkaline soil. That's what the pH of a soil is testing. Most of us around here have an acid soil, so we don't have lots of free calcium. And some crops, like our brassicas, prefer growing in a calcium soil. So this is, you might get brassica deficiencies like hollow stems and things like that because they're lacking, well, that's a boron deficiency, but you can get stunted growth and stuff from calcium deficiencies. So to correct that, if we've done our pH test, we can add lime in the autumn ready for the crop the next year. Then we've got magnesium, again, is needed for cell growth. And this can cause, in the open ground is not usually a problem, but in pot plants, and I know many of you are growing in pots, magnesium shortage can become a thing, and this can turn your leaves yellow. So there's several things that can give you chlorosis of the leaves, that's yellowing of the leaves. Nitrogen deficiency, magnesium deficiency, and overwatering all can cause yellowing of leaves. But in pot plants, magnesium deficiency is one to look out for. And to correct that, we can water Epsom salts. And then the other one is sulfur, but that's not, doesn't usually show up as a deficiency. It usually has enough of that. And then there's a whole load of minor nutrients which plants need in very small quantities, and if you've got an organic soil, you don't have to worry about them at all. But again, if they're in pot plants, they can get those micro deficiencies. And then a good feed for that is a seaweed fertilizer. It's not very high in the major nutrients, but it has all the minor nutrients, and that's a really good boost to the plants if they need it. Okay, so next, oh, what have I done? Sorry. So this little picture here shows you about soil pH. There's a little testing kit you can get, costs a couple of quid. You put a bit of soil in it and it gives you a rough idea of what your soil's like. You can also talk to your neighbours or local farmers. And neutral is 7, and then you've got acid or alkaline. And when you're on the extremes of those, it can lock up some of the nutrients. So knowing your pH can help you identify some of these deficiencies. But some plant families like different soil conditions. So if you know what pH your soil is, then it gives you a good indicator of what plants you should be growing. So I've mentioned brassicas like alkaline soil. A lot of the soft fruit like acid soil. And when you go, you know, from soft fruit, you go into blueberries. Blueberries can cope with very acid soil, and that's why we get all the bilberries growing in the Hafren forest, in the pine woods, in the conifer woods. So this shows you some plant families, and botanically the Latin name of a family always ends in aci, so you've got leguminaceae, and often these are shortened to legumes. So all your legumes are your beans and peas, and they're all in the same family, and they're all nitrogen fixing. So if we know what family things are in, we know what conditions they like. So if we know they're nitrogen fixing, they make their own nitrogen with a symbiotic relationship with soil bacteria. They will grow in quite deficient soils. So we don't have to worry about feeding them nitrogen because they can make their own. And so understanding that plant family tells us that. It also tells us that they're quite a good companion to other plants because they're not going to compete for nitrogen. And if you leave the roots in the soil, those nitrogen full nodules remain in the soil and can break down ready for the crop that's going in next. Then we've got the alliums or Alliaceae, that's all the onion family, and they're very good companions because they smell strong, so they deter pests by the smell. But they're quite a big family, and it also includes spring onions and chives, which people tend to put those in different beds, and spring onions are quite quick growing, so they get put in different beds. And we have alliums growing all year round because we'll have onions in the ground now and garlic, and then we're just planting our leeks now, so they tend to be in different beds, but they're in the ground at the same time, and then we harvest our onions and garlic, and the leeks are still in, and the leeks are still in the soil when we plant our garlic again in the autumn. So they're always there, and any disease on them carries from one crop to the next to the next. So it's very hard to eradicate some of the onion diseases. They're prone to rust. They're also prone to white rot, which is soil-borne. So it's very important to rotate that crop because that soil that can build up in the soil, and once you've got it, it's there for 10 years. So it's quite important to understand which plants belong in that family, so that you're not planting alliums in every one of your beds in your garden. Then we've got the cucurbits, cucumbers, courgettes, marrows, squashes, gourds. These are all crops that like warmer temperatures. They like it to be 10 degrees minimum, and they come from hot climates and would grow in the understory. So they've got big leaves to capture the sun because they come from a hot climate. Obviously, we're not a hot climate, we don't have a lot of sun, so they need to not be shaded out by other things, but be able to get nice warm conditions. And this is why they're struggling at the moment, and you're getting rotten fruit because it's not as warm as it should be. Nighttime temperature on my farm was 2 degrees the last couple of nights. Squashes don't like that at all. They like a minimum temperature of 10 degrees. So when the temperature drops below 10 degrees, they stop producing female flowers. So then you'll stop getting any fruit. So hopefully the nighttime temperature will pick up again. Down in the bottom corner, we've got umbelliferas. That's an old name, but I stick to it because I prefer it, because the flowers look like umbrellas. Apiaceae is the new name, which doesn't seem to relate to anything. Now, the root vegetables, it gets confusing because people put potatoes in the root vegetables, Swedes in the root vegetables, but potatoes are solanaceae and Swedes are brassicas. So the roots are actually carrots, parsnip, celery, celeriac, parsley, coriander, and they all have these umbrellas of flowers. And that family doesn't like any competition at all. We're going to look at that family more deeply today. Their root have big tap roots. They don't like those tap roots being disturbed, so you don't transplant them. You sow them where they're going to be, you leave them alone, and then you thin them so they've got enough space to grow, and you make sure they're weed free. So they're not good companion planting with other things too close to them, or you'll end up with small carrots and parsnips. But we're going to cover that more lately, so I won't talk about that more. Solanaceae, the main ones are potatoes and tomatoes, but also aubergines and peppers are in that family. All prone to blight, particularly potatoes and tomatoes can get blight. If your tomatoes are in a greenhouse, you can vent it and reduce the humidity. You can water deep into the soil so that it's not evaporating, creating humidity. But outside in the field, you can't do anything about the Welsh humid climate, and blight is the problem. And they're very hungry crops, so they really benefit from a lot of organic matter early on and mulching as they're growing. And like I said, with the tomatoes, you could be feeding them with a high potassium feed now. And then the Pseudomypodiaceae, that's a good name, isn't it? This is spinach, beetroot, beets, chard, Swiss chard, perennial spinach, all of those sort of crops. And you know, a beetroot, you can eat the beetroot leaves. It's the chards and Swiss chard, have all developed from that same original plant from the wild. They're all prone to bolting if it gets too hot and dry, but they are also very productive. And then we come to the biggest vegetable family, which is brassicas. There's a lot of brassicas that we grow, and a lot of them take up a lot of space, so you don't get many in a bed. And brassicas are really prone to club root, which is a soil-borne disease. So it's one of those families that is really important to rotate and not grow back in that same soil for as long as possible. But within that family, there's some root brassicas, which people often mistake as being in the root family. So things like radish and swede and turnip are not in the root family, they're in the brassica family. And all these families are put together because of how they flower. So if you look at a flower of a plant, they'll all have similar flowers. So the brassicas, they used to be called crucifixi because the flowers have 4 petals. And brassicas are one of those families which are amazing. From the wild Brassica oleracea, plant breeders have selected for big leaves like cabbages and kale, for lateral buds like the Brussels sprouts, for swollen stems like kohlrabi, swollen, you got flowers like the cauliflower and broccoli. And so plant breeders have selected that and kept selecting, so they got bigger and bigger cauliflowers, whereas the wild one would just be a few flowers on a stick. But that whole family are very hungry and have the same pests and disease. So the cabbage white butterfly will be attracted to the smell of all of these. So a good companion for your brassicas is something that's smelly, so the butterfly can't smell that crop. If you're weeding or hoeing or thinning or whatever, or have thinnings, bury them in your compost heap so you're reducing the smell so it's not attracting the pests. So like I said, a lot of brassicas, the planting distances are quite a long way apart, and you think, do I need to plant them that far apart? Can't I plant them closer together? But these planting distances have been researched for many, many years by many growers, many farmers, and many research scientists. And the planting distances are the optimum planting distance to get you the biggest yield from that area of space. So if you choose to plant them closer together, you'll just get a smaller crop. And sometimes that's a good thing, because if you put your cabbages 45 centimeters apart, you will get nice big headed cabbage. But for most people, that's far too big to deal with. They can't eat a whole cabbage in a week. So putting them smaller together will give you smaller heads of cabbage. So that's something to consider. And if you go for further distances than recommended, and the plants don't have, or even if you go to the recommended planting distance, but the plants don't have enough nutrients because your soil is poor, then they don't grow big. But what happens with that space in between is it just allows weeds to grow. And many of the weeds can grow in poor soil, which your crop might not do well in. So the optimum spacing is really important. But if you look at brassicas and it says 45 centimeters apart, or things like Brussels sprouts or purple sprouting, 75 centimeters apart, that's huge. Some people, that means they can only plant one in their meter square bed. But what you can do is you can utilize the big empty space around that plant with quick growing catch crops that will grow and give you a harvest before your main crop needs that space. So when we think about intercropping, catch cropping, this is when you really need to have a bit of gardening experience, because you can't learn this easily from a book. You just have to, it's a bit of trial and error, and you have to be really harsh sometimes. And if your plants are competing, you have to just get rid of one of them. because otherwise they're both going to suffer. So the planting time is really important with this catch cropping, because you need to get your catch crop out of the way before your main crop needs that space. And if your catch crop is in there too long, it makes the environment humid when it's rainy, and so then you start getting mildew and fungus and slugs. And if it's really hot, you start to get things bolting because there's not enough moisture for the two plants, and you get this competition battle going on. So fast crops that we can think about are things like lettuce. You can get a quick crop of lettuce. You could just harvest it once and then get it out the way. Or you might get 2 or 3 crops out of it before that space is needed. But the important thing is to get rid of it at the right time and go, okay, I could get another crop out of it, but my main crop is suffering, so it's time to get rid of it. I've mentioned spring onions. I don't find them particularly fast growing, so I never use them as a quick catch crop. But if you've got good fertile soil, they are supposed to be one that's quite quick. Beetroot, they say, is quite quick, but again, I never find it that quick. Radish, very quick, 6 to 8 weeks. Spinach is pretty quick, and it's very quick to bolt, so it's quite often finishing out the way before your main crop. And some of the herbs like coriander I find bolts very quickly, so I quite often use that as a catch crop, and I just get one harvest out of it and then get it out the way. But when you're doing these fast catch crops, you have to also think about your rotation and your plant families that we've looked at. So if you're putting quick rows of radish in between lots of different vegetables, you've then put brassicas in every crop bed. So you do need to think about your rotation and make a bit of a plan. Okay, I'm going to use radish as a companion in this bed, and I'll use lettuce as a companion in that bed, and that way you're keeping your rotation going. Yeah, you can use fast growing crops. You can also use fertility building crops like green manures. So a green manure is like the clover and tares that I showed you. A green manure is a plant that is grown purely to benefit the soil. So the leguminous green manures are adding nitrogen to the soil. Some are fast growing like mustard, and that just keeps the soil covered, protects from leaching and losses, and then you cut it and dig it in, and it's providing bulky organic matter. And some are deep rooted and bring up lower nutrients from lower down. But with all of these, the timing is absolutely crucial, because you don't want those catch crops to be competing with the main event. So sometimes you can plant them at the same time. Sometimes you sow one plant earlier and then you put your main one in and then follow on. So I can give you a couple of examples of things that I do. In my polytunnel, early on in the season, I'll plant chard and spinach, and I'll do 2 rows in my bed in the polytunnel. Quite very early, because they're quite hardy and you can get away with doing them quite early, maybe March or something. And then they grow and I get 1 crop off of them and I harvest it, and then it's time to plant my tomatoes, and I do 3 rows of tomatoes. So I basically harvest the spinach and the chard, and then there's nothing there because I've harvested it, but the plants are still there, but they're very small because I've just harvested. And then I put my 3 rows of tomatoes in, and there's plenty of room because I've just harvested. So I put my 3 rows of tomatoes in. They're very small. They start growing. And then I get another crop of chard and spinach, and my tomatoes are still growing. And then once my tomatoes get to a certain size, they start shading out the spinach and the chard, and the leaves start growing into each other. And then it starts to get a bit humid and damp, and there's no airflow. And that's when I know I need to get rid of the spinach and chard. And I've had a crop, even if I've only had 1 harvest, it's a bonus crop harvest. So rather than the soil sitting there doing nothing, I've managed to get a quick catch crop in. So that's what we're looking at. The other thing I do in the field at the moment, I have 2 rows of peas in my bed. and I'm cropping them now, and I'm on to third picking on those, but there's a big gap in between those peas. And so I've planted in that gap some squashes, and they're winter squashes, and it means I've planted them, they're protected by the peas. It's a bit tricky to get in the middle of the bed and plant them, but they're protected from the wind and things from the peas. They're slowly getting themselves going, and my peas are almost over. I'm going to crop them again this week, and then those plants will come out and the bed will be clear for the squashes to spread out and fill that gap. So that's companion planting, not in the traditional way of, you know, scented plants, but they're working together, and successionally rather. One is following on from the other, but rather than waiting till I've cleared the bed to plant, I'm planting before I clear the bed. And that way it gives me that extra bit of time that's needed, because if I wait till the peas are finished, it'll be too late to put the squashes in and get a crop out of them. And so, like I say, this is very difficult for new growers. But as new growers, the best thing you can do is record what you do this year and then learn from that next year. And then when you come to next year, look at your diary. Oh, I planted it then. How long did it take to harvest? Or how long did it get to get big and fill that space? Have I got time for a quick crop in between? And be really strict with yourself and a little bit harsh with the crops, and go, those two are competing. I need to get it out. One other thing I do with successional sowing, again with peas, is I do very early peas, and then they'll be followed by another crop later in the season. But if this is particularly in the polytunnel, I'll do overwintering peas in the polytunnel, and they're supposed to be cropped at the end of May. And of course, by the end of May, I need my summer crops to go in the polytunnel. But if I get to the second, third week of May and those peas have not developed peas in the pod, then I just crop them as Monge 2, eat them as flat pods, and get rid of the plant, so that it's not delaying me put my next crop in. Because if I delay putting my next crop in, then I won't get a harvest from that. So sometimes you cut your losses on one to make sure that you're getting a double cropping over the season. And I think it looks nice. You know, you look at these pictures and you've got some nice tall onions and some lettuces underneath that. You've got some brassicas with lettuce. You've got different things planted together, and it gives different colours mixed up in your garden, which is nice. So when we are thinking about, okay, how is this going to work? What crops can I put together? Think about what crops' needs are. And we've talked about plant families, and generally within a plant family, they like similar sort of things. So you can put shade lovers with taller plants. The Pseudomopodiaceae, the chard, spinach, beetroot, they prefer it to be a bit shady, a bit cooler, lettuce. So you can put them underneath the shade of taller climbing beans and things like that. And of course, your French beans and runner beans, they take a little while to get going at the beginning of the season. And you can have your lettuces and chard and things growing in a row underneath your runner beans. And then by the time your runner beans are in full flow and you're standing there picking your crop, your lettuce is gone and finished, you've harvested it and cleared that space. You can train your squashes and cucumbers and things up poles and trellis, and then that gives a bit of space on the soil underneath. And like I said before, you can utilise the space of slow growing crops with something faster, like early spinach and chard, radish, beetroot, turnips. Yeah, turnips are pretty fast to put in. So radish and turnip are actually in your brassica family, so they're a good fast crop to put in between your slower growing brassicas, like your purple sprouting and your Brussels sprouts that are big distance apart and quite slow growing. So that brings us on to that competition thing. And, you know, I've said about being harsh and getting rid of one crop to give space for the next. But when we talk about our root plants, they don't like any competition. So don't think about really companion planting right up to these, because they won't deal with it. And they don't even deal with competition from themselves. They have a sort of ability to go, oh, I'm a bit close to you, I'm not going to grow anymore. And I look at lots of people's carrot beds in August, and they say, do you think my carrot's going to make it? They haven't grown for ages, and they've never thinned them, and so they just stop growing. So my carrot beds, this is my carrot beds here now, and you can see the spacing. So I've basically thinned once. I went through and thinned everything to about 1 to 2 centimeters apart. That was the first thinnings. And those first thinnings are tiny little carrots. Some of them are minute, some of them are about this big. And we eat them, we eat the lot. Those first ones, the leaves are edible. They're not very stringy, and you can use the whole lot. But that first thing is really important, because however hard you've tried to sow thinly, carrots are very small seeds, and you will have always oversown. So that you need to do that first thinning quite early. So I've got a 25-meter bed, so I did that over 3 weeks, and we ate that harvest ourselves. And now this is the spacing they are now. So now I'm going to do the second thinning, which will thin them out to about 5 centimeters, 2 inches. And then the second thinning, the carrots are now sort of so big, 6 inches, 5, 6 inches. They're a decent sized carrot. I can sell them as bunch carrots with carrot tops on. And that's my second thinning. And so that's actually, when you come to the second thinning, that's a proper crop of decent sized carrots. And then basically that's what I do right the way through the season. So my carrots, because I'm on a big scale, I sow them in rows, because a row you can hoe easily and keep on top of the weeds. If you're working on a small plot, you can scatter sow them, but you need a very weed-free bed to do that, because you can't hoe it. So you need to make sure it's weed-free before you start, and then you can scatter your seeds all over the bed. So you could have a metre square bed, foot square bed, and then you can, if you need to, you can hand weed and you can thin out, and you get many, many more carrots for the space if you scatter sow them than you do if you plant them in a row. But you have to hand weed because you can't hoe it. So that's the thing. The other crop to thin out is your parsnips. So again, your parsnips, you can scatter sow them, you can sow them in rows, you can sow them at stations. Every 6 inches, 15 centimeters apart, you put a few seeds, and then they have their space. Again, thin down. Swedes, they're a later crop. Swedes don't go in until sort of April, May time. And so I'm just thinning my Swedes now. And beetroot, you need to thin. Sometimes they're grown in clumps. You can transplant them from modules in a cluster of 3. That's becoming quite a common way of growing them now. And basically with the beetroot and radish, you're eating them as you thin them. So the radish, you don't need to thin out like carrots, but as they're very fast growing, so at about 5 weeks, you just start taking the first ones that look big enough to eat. And then you just continue to do that right the way through. And the same with beetroots. The first ones you pick are quite small, and then eventually they get to big size. And like I say, if you don't do the thinning, they just don't develop. They don't get any bigger. So what do root vegetables like? Thinning is a must, and you need to be doing that now. All of the root vegetables, so I've put Sweden turnip in here, even though they're brassicas, it's still the root that we're developing and that we're eating. They like a light sandy soil. Now most of us around here have got a heavy clay soil. So in our preparation, we can add some sand into the bed, which will improve it. And obviously we're rotating our plants, or we're polycropping, mix them all up. But we can add sand into the bed that we're going to do our roots. and then we can do that every year for our root vegetables. And within our rotation, our soil gradually gets better and better. So it benefits all the crops in turn. So I've put thinning twice. It's very important, the thinning, so I've listed it twice. So the pests that we get, they're attracted by the smell. So carrots and parsnips are attracted by the carrot root fly. It smells them and it's attracted by the smell. So every time we hoe, weed or thin, we're releasing that smell into the air, and they come in, fly in for miles. So at that point, we want to bury our thinnings into the compost heap so they can't smell it, but also put down strong smelling stuff. So some people scatter old coffee grounds if you have percolated coffee. Some people make a garlic solution. What I do, I'm not a coffee drinker and I've not got time to make solutions. So what I do is I have a big lemon balm plant, and I just cut a load of lemon balm, carry it down to the bed with me and scatter it along the path. And then I'm walking on it as I'm hoeing and weeding and stuff. And that smell is then put out, and that's stronger than the carrot and parsnip smell. Same with sweets and turnips. It's not the carrot root fly, obviously, because it's a different family, but there is a root pest that affects the brassicas. So again, you don't want that smell going out there. So thinning, how to do it. After rain is very good because the soil is wet, it's saturated, and the roots just pull out easily. They gently pull out, and so you're not disturbing them too much. With the beetroot and the radish, when you pull them, you can land up pulling out the whole cluster. So it involves two hands. You're sort of holding that lot down in the soil and you're pulling this one out. But carrots, generally, you might have to do that a little bit, but usually they just pull straight out because they're straight down roots. So you do the thinning several times over the season. So like I say, I've already done my early thinnings, my first thinning. That's the important one, because if you don't do that, they never develop. And then after that, it's basically harvest. It's a thinning harvest operation. And you're doing that every few weeks. You harvest, or even every week, you harvest a few carrots and you're thinning as you go. So you can thin out and eat the young plants as you go. So it's not waste, because people hate throwing plants away. So we've been eating carrot tops for about a month now. So I'm ready to stop eating carrot tops, and chard for that matter. So basically you can see in the left-hand picture there, there's a tiny little carrot in there. Some of those carrot tops have just been cut off from little baby carrots that we have used, and some have got tiny carrots on it and carrot tops. And they're not tough and fibrous because they haven't developed the roots yet. So they're just leafy, like they're a bit like a parsley, I suppose. And so you can use it as a herb. You can put it in cooking, soups, stews, whatever. What we've been doing is making pesto with it, because we can use bulk amounts of it. And you can add, wild garlic, fresh garlic. We've been using our own hazelnuts, which are a bit hard, but cashew nuts are softer, pine nuts are even softer, seeds, whatever you want. And it's a great way of getting rid of that that crop that would have been in the compost heap normally. So planning succession. Succession is when you're sowing several times in the season. And a lot of new growers, or even traditional growers, allotment growers, often get to Easter and go, okay, it's planting season. They plant everything, one lot of planting, and then harvest is in the autumn, or through the season. But what we should be thinking about, if we're thinking about food security and self-sufficiency, is that successional growth, so that we've always got something coming. So those things that you sowed early are bolting or finished, or you've taken that harvest. So you want that to continue on. So your early lettuce is now coming to an end. It's bolted, it's getting bitter. So you should have sown some more lettuce 2 or 3 weeks ago. So you've got the next lot coming on. Peas and beans, the broad beans are coming to an end now. We don't sow more broad beans because we've moved into French beans and runner beans, so we continue with those. But peas we can sow 3 or 4 times a year, which gives us a succession of peas right the way through the season. So we can extend the season by pushing the boundaries of what the books say, and we can get things in early, but then be ready to protect them from the weather. Now, obviously this year we had really good hot weather, our best bit of summer early on, and this is becoming the norm now. Every spring we have this hot weather, but we can still get the cold nights. So you need to have some fleeces or some plastic hoops that you can, cloche tunnels that you can put over and protect your early crops. But you'll be surprised how many things are hardy. So lettuce, spinach, chard are all quite hardy, and they will cope with being outside early. But things like runner beans and French beans are not. So if you plant them out, they're going to get clobbered by the cold. You can also grow things ready to transplant. So you can have them started in pots, and you can put them on into bigger pots, ready to put out in the ground as soon as there's a space. And as I said before, you need to be quite harsh and get ready to rip out your plants when the harvest starts dwindling, because it's diminishing returns. Things like peas, you get a good first crop, good second crop. By the third crop, they're starting to diminish a bit, and then you get less and less each time you go and harvest. And at that point, you can go, well, I could get rid of that crop now, and I could be putting something else in there, and I've still got time left for it to harvest before we get our first frost, end of September, October, whenever your first frost is. Or like I said earlier, try and squeeze a crop in next to it that can be developing while that one finishes. And part of your succession is protecting your soil as well. So if you have got a gap in your rotation and the soil is uncovered, even for a week, cover it up. So you can either put quick growing green manure, that needs 6 weeks, so that's quite a long-term commitment, 6 weeks minimum, or you can use a ground cover fabric, or you can just put some wood chip, grass cuttings or something on which protects the soil. It might feed the soil if it's an organic matter, suppresses the weeds, keeps the moisture in, so that you're building soil while it's not in use and protecting it ready for when your crop goes in. I'm growing on quite a big scale, and if I leave a bed uncovered for any length of time at all, the weeds are up, and then I don't have the time to get it back into action. I use a lot of ground cover fabric, I use a lot of grass cutting mulch just to control the weeds while my back's turned, and it saves time and it looks after the soil. So we've talked about crops as companions, as catch crops, as succession, but when you look at the books, companion planting is about smell and beauty and insects and biodiversity. And I particularly like this picture that I took at the National Botanic Gardens of Wales, and it's just outside their main restaurant cafe area. And it's salads and onions and leafy veg, and it just looks beautiful. To me, that's just as beautiful as any ornamental garden, and it's all harvestable crops. I mean, part of the beauty is the sweeping semicircle, the way they've laid it out. But the different heights and colours of the crops, I think, are really nice too. So the idea of companion planting is it can look beautiful, but the main advantage is it discourages a lot of the garden pests. So it's reducing the monoculture, and I've talked a lot today about plant families and rotation and grouping things together and things like that. And that is creating a monoculture, which pests love because they hone in on that one crop, that smell. And in a way, we want to avoid that monoculture. And companion plants can help us do that by mixing things up a bit, adding different plants in there. So we can pick strong scented plants which will mask the smell. So like I was saying with the carrots and carrot root fly and brassicas, or we can introduce plants that are sacrificial plants, that the pests will eat those instead of our crop plant. I'm not so keen on this idea because I don't find it actually works. You know, things like nasturtium attract black fly aphid, and you're supposed to put your nasturtiums next to your broad beans because broad beans get very affected with black fly. But I just think if you're then attracting black fly to that bed where you've got your broad beans. So I'd rather plant my nasturtiums somewhere else, and hopefully they'll go somewhere else and nowhere near my broad bean bed. Another one that gets talked a lot about is plant hostas, because slugs love hostas and then they'll stay off your lettuce. But a hosta plant will cost you 5, 6, 7 quid, and a lettuce costs you a few pence. So I don't find that a good example either, and that's in quite a lot of books. So the advantages are you're protecting from pests. Some companions, like I showed you, the clover underplanted with your brassicas, can protect from pests like that, or like the aphids that I've mentioned. Some companions can deter diseases just by allopathic properties, and some things are protecting the environment, so you're keeping the soil covered, so you're reducing leaching and losses. And like I said again, it looks attractive. You've got in this picture, various different coloured crops. You've got tagetes, marigolds, eggplants, all looking lovely. The disadvantages are they can compete with light, nutrient and water, which is what this whole session's been about. And so it's important that, again, you're harsh with your companion plant. And if your companion plant is doing too well or getting too big and your crop plant is struggling, then you need to take one of them out or remove some leaves or raise the canopy or something so that you haven't got that competition there. And also, your companion plants can carry pests and disease. So, if you were using something like a wallflower or Sweet William or something, they're in the brassica family. And if you're using those as a companion plant, you have to be aware it's in the brassica family. And so that will have the same pests and disease. And if you're trying to rotate and then suddenly you put that in the mix, it's another brassica. So there are things to consider. You can mix it up. I said about shade-loving plants. You can mix up root depth. So fibrous, shallow roots like lettuce could be grown with deeper tap roots like your beans. And then they're not in the same root zone. The water is in a different area, so they're not competing for water. And the nutrients, they're not competing. So I've put lettuce and carrots there, but carrots, I said earlier, are not good companions to anything because they don't like the competition. So you have to be quite careful if you're doing lettuce and carrots. And again, it's about getting that quick catch crop of lettuce while your carrots are developing. So you could put in some plug plants of lettuce in between your rows of carrots at the time you sow your carrots. Your carrots are going to take a couple of weeks to germinate, then they're going to take another couple of weeks to be big enough to thin. So that's a month worth of your lettuce growing, by which time you'll be harvesting that lettuce. And so when you do your first thinnings of carrot, you'll be doing your first harvest of lettuce. And then you can get a second crop of lettuce and then take it out of the mix, so there's no competition there. Beans and beetroot, I also said about chard and spinach under your beetroot, and turnips and nasturtium. Nasturtium, same family as brassicas, so they're good together. But the nasturtiums are strong smelling, but not strong smelling of brassicas, so they don't attract the same flying pests. You could put heavy feeders with nitrogen fixers. This is a very common one that's talked about, and most people have heard of it, the Three Sisters. All the results and trials that have been done on this were originally done in the hot climates where these plants belong. And so the results showed that the land equivalent ratio of growing them together gave you a higher crop yield for that space. But that is in hot, sunny climates. Sweet corn likes hot, sunny Mediterranean climates. Squashes, courgettes like very hot climates. So if you have them in a hot climate, the sweet corn grows tall and high, and then that can support the beans, and the squashes like the shade underneath the sweet corn. But we're in Wales, which is a bit grey and cloudy, and to get our courgettes and pumpkins off to a really good start, we need them to have full sun, and the same with the sweet corn. So this three companions doesn't work so well in Wales as it does in other climates, but the theory's there, it's just the climate's not right. So you've got the beans climbing up your stems of the sweet corn, but if it's not warm enough, the sweet corn doesn't get big enough and the beans strangle the sweet corn. But you could try similar sort of things, maybe 2 of the crops together, not 3. Basil is supposed to be a very good companion with tomatoes. It's supposed to make your tomatoes taste better and more flavoursome. I mean, it definitely does when you crop it and harvest it and put it in a bowl together. Whether or not it actually has that effect in reality on the growing tomato, I don't know. But it's supposed to repel flies and mosquitoes and things like that. One thing I do plant basil underneath my tomatoes, in between my tomato plants, and I find it starts well because it's growing before the tomatoes are big, and it gets onto a really good start, grows well. Take a couple of crops off of it, and then the tomatoes get big and swamp the basil, and not enough sun gets through, and then they struggle for a few weeks, and it's damp under there, and they start rotting. But then you can take the lower leaves off your tomatoes, which I've been doing this week, and that lifts the canopy of the tomatoes, allows sun in to the basil again, and sun into the tomatoes to ripen. So that works quite well. This is one that I don't do, but a lot of books say chamomile is a tonic to every single plant. It brings up calcium, potassium, and sodium, which all plants need for growth. So they say, sow it, let it self-seed, and just grow all over your garden. And then you can just pull it out where you need to, so that there's no competition going on. This is another one that's well known, onions and carrots together, because the smell of the onions ward off the carrot root fly, and the smell of carrots ward off the onion root fly. Lots of trials done on this, but generally you need to grow more onions than carrots for the carrot root fly, and more carrots for the onions for the onion root fly. But saying that, you're going to help whatever by mixing it up a bit. So you could have 1 row of onions, 1 row of carrots, 1 row of onions, 1 row of carrots, just to mask the smells. Onions and brassicas, again, onions are strong smelling, so are brassicas, and they ward off each other pests. Geranium, very strong smelling plant. Now, these things don't need to be in the bed with your vegetables. They could be a pot plant that you just move about, put on the end of the bed, or what have you. Lemon balm, I mentioned, very strong smelling. Marigolds, you've got the common calendula or hardy annual, which is a good companion. You can eat the flowers, and that it's got flat flower, which attracts hoverfly, and hoverfly eats aphids. Or what's in this picture at the bottom is tagetes, which is a half hardy annual, so it won't survive frost. So you generally buy it in as a bedding plant. A great companion in the greenhouse. It wards off whitefly because of the strong smell. So we've talked about monoculture, we talked about plant families, knowing those plant families, you can group them together, you can mix them up. And you can go one extreme from that, companion planting and mixing up, to polyculture, the opposite of monoculture. And in this theme, instead of grouping your plant families together, you're aware of the plant families, so you know what plant is in which plant family, but then you're totally mixing them up. and you're planting different plants of different things together, which is what a lot of you are doing anyway, because you're growing in pot plants. So you might have one tomato and one brassica and one chard, and that's a polyculture because you have lots of different plants and you're mixing them all up, and it confuses the pest because there's not a strong smell of anything. There's just a diverse system with lots of different plants. So polycropping, you mix all plants together. Square foot gardening is a type of polyculture. In this, you measure a square foot or a square 30 centimeters, and you put one plant family in that 30 centimeters. So that might be one cabbage or one chard, or 4 or so onions or garlic or something, which is easier to manage because it's easier to weed. You know where things are, and if you're new to growing, you can recognize it because you've got a plan, and in that square there should be this. So that's quite a good method for new growers on a small scale. Forest gardening is mimicking nature. So you're using your garden with its trees and its shrubs, and you're using that to grow your crops. So you may climb your climbing beans, your runner beans, up your trees and use your tree trunk as a support for your runner and French beans. And climbers will naturally climb up to the light, so they're not competing for light because that's what climbers do. And then you have little clearings where the sun's getting to it, where you can plant your annual veg that needs a bit more sunshine. That's forest garden idea. On a bigger scale, on a commercial scale, you're mimicking nature as it is in the forest, but you're putting it in straight lines. So you've got agriculture and forestry together. So basically this is putting in big thick hedgerows in your agriculture, and so you have the benefit of the protection of the trees from the wind, and creating shade and microclimate. You've got the biodiversity of the big hedgerow shelter belt, the wildflowers and things like that for all the hoverflies and pest predators to live. And then you've got your crop rows of annual crops. So in nature, when we talk about succession, we're talking much longer term. And in succession, what you get is you get your annual plants first, which create lots of organic matter and build the soil. And then as they die off each year, they're building soil, and you start to get perennial plants come up. And then those perennial plants stabilize the soil, put in some root structure. And some of those perennial plants are a bit spiky, like brambles, for example, and blackthorn starts growing up, and spiky things grow up so that the bigger animal predators can't get in. And then your shrubs develop, and then your trees can grow out of that, and then you land up with forest and edge of forest where you have the annual stuff. And so we want to remember this when we're growing our veg plants, because we're taking a natural system and trying to hold it in a permanent annual state, whereas in natural succession, eventually it will become woodland. So to hold it in a permanent annual state, we need to keep adding in that organic matter, which brings me right back to the first slide, which was all about soil health and how we look after the soil. And because we keep taking the annual crops and asking them to keep providing food for us, we need to be putting back that organic matter, which our trees would be doing for us in nature every time they lose their leaves. I'm going to scoot off of this. So this is the idea of agroforestry that I talked about. So it's a polyculture, but it's a very commercial polyculture because it's not all muddled up. It's linear, so you can hoe it, so you can organize it, so you can harvest it quickly, and so it can be productive. And this is my plot, which on my plot we are aiming towards an agroforestry system. We've been on my plot for about 9 years, I think now, and I have these ridge and furrow permanent veg beds, which we are mulching every year and working towards a minimum dig system. And I have 10 of these beds, and then I have hedgerows, which we're a very windy site, so we have to slow the wind down across the site. So I have 30 of these beds, so there's 3 blocks of 10 with a hedge growing in between each one. And then we have the big field that we do with the tractor. But out of all of them, I prefer this system, which is minimum dig, and it is creating lots of really good soil on there now just by mulching. And we use a lot of grass cuttings. We have a lot of lawn, and we find the grass cuttings great. It makes really good soil, suppresses the weeds, and we have lots of it, and it's a free resource, and grass keeps growing, so you've constantly got that organic matter to use. And on bigger areas where we have shrubs and trees, we put cardboard down first and then put the grass cuttings on top, and then we don't have to look at it again for 3 months, because the cardboard slowly rots down, but it completely blankets out the light and stops all the weeds growing. And that's our way of dealing with the competition. We've changed our veg beds now. You can see there we've got grass paths, and we found the grass paths very hard to manage. We're having to trim them all the time, and of course they grow sideways into the bed, so we're now laying down permanent porous plastic on them, just to cut down some of the maintenance. So that's my bed. We're gone past 8 o'clock now, so I'm going to stop sharing that. So I hope that was useful. A lot of information, and I know for new growers,